It's great to see so many friends from all around the world. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I want to refer back to 27 years to 1989. Catherine, the book was published in 89. We started working on it earlier. So when you said written, yeah, it was written over a period of time. But the publication date is 1989. I must say that we quarreled about the title. Because the word deeply rooted, the mouse moved. It was Ed Azar had used that, but some of us argued for intractable. Sounded good. Others said, no, if it's intractable, then it can't be solved. It can't be resolved. So we said, well, in the dictionary, intractable also means difficult, hard. So we won the argument, and it became the resolution of intractable conflicts, the transformation, which was an important word. And I'm going to play with these things. These are n-grams. Which Google, digitized everything. All the books in English and many other languages. And if you go on the web and go to Google Books Ngram Reviewer, you can put in any word you like and any year spans you want. All these are from 1940 to 2008. That's as far as they've gone so far, at least to make available. And it tells you the percentage at each year of the words in the English language which you have selected. So you can see that the words intractable conflicts in red began, and an intractable conflict transportation, they both rose as a real little spike for 1989. Notice that. But it goes up, both of them rise, and there's a little bit of a downturn at the end, and watch that. And that obviously was part of the general movement of, I can't see very well on that one, so I'm going to move this up a little bit, of the conflict resolution as a term. And that also shows a little downturn at the end in recent years. I want to talk about three things: the context for conflict transformation in the last 30 years, changes in the study and practice of conflict transformation, and some current challenges. There really are significant changes in the context for our work. Obviously, globalization, economic integration, no longer a bipolar world, kind of a little bit more hegemonic, a little more multipolar, but certainly not a Cold War world system. Interventions more by the UN, NATO, and a bunch of new actors. And there are several papers dealing with some of these changes. The new actors, the ones that I looked up in Figure 3, which I hope is up there. Is Figure 3 up there? NGOs and communal identities are increased, and again, even they have turned down. There also were changes in normative conditions. The idea of human rights rose quite a bit, and even that's turned down. Feminism, quite a rise, not continuing. So there have been declines in many ways in some of the things which were supportive and consistent with a constructive approach to the transformation of intractable conflicts. There also have been important changes in the field. I wanted to just point to a couple things. There's the Beyond Intractability project, which is a very important website that was started quite early in the years, and it continues. It's now moving into trying to give these mass open moose, moose. But they seem to have a little hitch with it. But it's a very important source for material about intractable conflicts. I discovered there's a new one at the University of Oxford, where I was just mentioning Scott Atran, who's an anthropologist, who's been doing a lot of work on sacred values and on terrorism. There was just a conference a couple years ago where Peter Coleman was at, and I wanted to ask you about that conference. It seems very interesting. It's honoring Herb Kelman, and Herb used it to discuss some new reframing of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, or Israeli Jews and Palestinians. I careful in using Israeli as referring to all citizens of the state, and so sometimes we'll remind us that there are Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. He talked about and published about two states, one homeland, one country. And the idea that both people think of that whole area as their homeland, as their country. So how do you have two states but still allow everybody to share into some ways being in the same homeland, because they both think of that all as their homeland? It's a different reframing of what the conflict is about. And finally, just as another example, a number of books have come out. This one was from a workshop that the U.S. Institute of Peace sponsored on transforming intractable conflicts. Okay, back to, I had so much fun with these engrams. You have to excuse me. And I recommend it to you. You have many pleasant hours. Try it in Hebrew and Arabic and Turkish and English. Some colleague did peace in English, French, and German. In English, it was pretty high frequency. In German, in French, it really was relatively infrequent. So I don't know that it posed more questions, but in any case, there was a kind of what is this one? Can you make out what's the word?
Trade-off versus win-win.
What?
Trade-off versus win-win.
Okay. See, look at what win-win did. It really spiked right after the book Getting to Yes was published, and trade-off is a little more moderate, obviously more conventional negotiating thing, but win-win just took off. But even that is taking a little downturn. There's stuff on methods. I looked at negotiation and mediation. I looked at dialogue. Where are we at now? I can't see. What figure is that? Negotiation. Okay. Then dialogue, demonstrations, and nonviolence. I was surprised that the nonviolence did not register very much. I expected that one would have spiked a couple times, but it didn't. And then, am I on to? Oops. I want to mention that the editors of the Intractable Conflicts book, Terry Northrup is still at the university, but she couldn't be here. But Stu Thorson and I are here. And okay. Oops. Why did it do that? Help. I have a couple more left.
That's why I don't use slides. So this is figure 9.
Okay. That's in redefinitions, and I showed this to Stu yesterday because he will speak something about redefinitions.
Unpopular that may now be.
So now I do want to turn this off. And I think we're facing a crisis. This is a good time for this conference. A lot of the things which we were on a roll, it seemed. The Cold War was transformed and ended. Apartheid has ended. Northern Ireland was transformed. We're kind of, we know how to do this. It happens. And right now, people don't feel like it's happened. Well, you could say there's the Iran treaty, but that ends up being apparently controversial. Looks like maybe Cyprus is going to be transformed, but that gets very little publicity. There is Colombia, from which Peter just came, and that does look like it's being transformed. But they don't. It's not where people's attention is being paid. It's being attended to the endless wars in the Middle East, endless for the United States. It seems the terrorism. It seems like everywhere, and so the whole sense of what's going on is preoccupied with something else than what we thought we were doing and what was possible to do. So one thing is, I think we should continue to apply the core ideas. I think they're still relevant, and they still can be applied to current stuff, but we are not doing as much of that application as we might. Again, Stu and Fred Carrier been working on North Korean-U.S. relations for a while, and one could say, well, could you use the models of transformation there as well? Nobody seems to be even considering it. And yet, what was done in the case of Iran could be applicable to North Korea. So we need to, I think, stress how we can use these same ideas and to some of the current concerns and make that more visible. And then, of course, finally, we do need to be more creative. The situations are changed. There are new actors, new constituencies. I think there has to be greater attention, or can be, to persuasion. We've always emphasized non-coercion is important. Well, if it's non-coercion, what is it? It's persuasion or offering benefits. And I'm glad that, at least with PARCC and Catherine's work, we have established some relationships to the people in rhetoric at this university. And I think it's interesting with the work on sacred values, the idea that that doesn't ever seem to be compromisable. It's sacred. You can't take it apart. Well, but you can put it in a different context. You can see through some dialogue, some understanding what that is and how that could be achieved. So I believe that the presentations at this conference do offer many new ideas, and They're necessary to help overcome the challenges that we face. So it's a great time for us to be here doing what we're doing. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. All right, there we go. Actually, I use them in class, but technology often slows things. So, hi, I'm glad to see everyone here. We've been a long time in organizing, and we had hoped to do this conference last spring, got moved, and then they put this meeting on after all our hard work. I first learned about intractable conflict from Lou many years ago. I don't want to say how many. Of course, for me, it's not a question of theory. In fact, my first visit here to Syracuse was at Lou's invitation. He had me speak as an Israeli peace activist, then on behalf of Peace Now. Now I'm with Combatants for Peace. It's a joint Israeli-Palestinian movement. And since then, of course, I've been here many times and had the honor of working with PARCC and participating in a number of projects initiated by Lou and by PARCC. I mention all this because in looking at intractable conflict, my perspective is far from theoretical, as I said. In fact, my very first comment to Lou when I heard about this was, why intractable? Because, of course, it sounded to me like it means there's no solution, this is it. It's a little scary. And I saw an article, I think it was in the New York Times, I'm not sure, where Obama is supposed to have said that Bibi is intractable. And he's right, I mean, that's true. But I'm also hoping that our conflict is not necessarily, at least in the meaning that I thought it had. And that's, of course, much more important for me, does intractable really mean that it can't be solved? And the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in particular the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, certainly is described as an intractable conflict, and ontologically, it's also, the definitions of intractability often are based on the Arab-Israeli or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It stands as something of a model because it's an ongoing conflict. These are your characteristics from the early days. Ongoing conflict, repeated cycles of violence, deep-seated identity issues, repeated failed attempts at resolution. That's us. Institutionalization of the conflict, and Peter Coleman added something like 57 characteristics of intractable conflict, viewing it as dynamic, of course, and I think you mentioned pervasiveness, that it spreads into functional aspects of life, including education and culture, institutionalization in many ways. And Herb Kelman and Danny Bartal, who was here, added the psychological and social psychology features. Danny's there, he's busy. Danny speaks of an ethos of conflict. And I think important is understanding what intractable conflict is. No less important, certainly for me, less than perhaps the model, is the way in which to change it, transformation of intractability. In other words, what are the factors within such a conflict that can be constructive? More recent work by Lou on constructive conflict. What are the factors within the conflict that can be more constructive, that can lead to change and possibly even resolution? And here too, in numerous groundbreaking publications, I might add, by Lou and by Peter, we've seen much more that's been done on this in terms of possibilities of transformation. So I think, as Lou has pointed out, the concept, the model is out there. It's part of the theoretical literature. It's the basis of much of the work in conflict resolution and peace studies. with additions, of course, that have come along with Bill Zartman's ripeness theory and Stedman's discussion of spoilers, Joe Montville and Fisher's Track 2 ideas of alternate dispute resolution. So these are all part of what we work with in conflict resolution and peace studies. So I think one of our objectives, perhaps the main objective in our conference, as Lou said, is to see how, if at all, the model or the concept of intractability and intractable conflict has changed. Is the concept still relevant? What factors or actors or dynamics have crept into it? What must now be taken into account? So we'll examine these matters not only theoretically, but also empirically, at least in terms of case studies that we're going to have, through the lens of past and also present conflicts, and with, of course, the help of the experts that we've brought here. I would suggest that some of the things and some of the factors that we may see as new when we're studying intractable conflict today are not so new. And some of them, like the role of women, have been there all along. But to some degree, what's changed is only sort of a broadening or an actual deepening of our view is what I mean. In other words, what got left out of the analysis in the past. The question that Cynthia Inlow raised, where are the women? That's a question that we now ask. It's now asked, and we also now find women. And it has indeed added a new dimension to what was previously missing. And so now we ask, where are the women? And we also find them. And it's not only a matter of noticing them, because they've been there all along, but in fact, it's also true that women are taking a much greater role today, certainly in conflict resolution and in transformation of conflict and in peacemaking. A recent study by Miriam Anderson found that some 40%, that is 55 out of 195 peace agreements that were signed between 1975 and 2011, some 40% contained references to women. And increasingly, women played a role, often as peace constituencies, in terms of the writing of these peace agreements. And also in the effort to reach negotiations altogether, as well as resolution. This increased role of women and the attention to women in peacemaking, especially in peace building, has been due, I think, to a number of things, mainly to changing norms, the growth of the importance, the salience of human rights norms, and of course, feminism, as Lou mentioned, the global women's movement, more specifically the United Nations Decades of Women, and then more recently the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. All of these focusing, bringing back this view of women, the role of women, and the need for a role of women in peacemaking. Another aspect, that of violence, has also been around a long time. It too has undergone both quantitative and qualitative change. I mean, low-intensity violence has been around, terrorism, political assassination. None of these is new. We've long had violence in many national liberation movements, and we've had many forms of political violence. There's no doubt that these have become, in a way, broader, salient, certain, more dangerous, perhaps. We have the new wars that Mary Calder talks about. And this is due, I think, in no small part to globalization, with its, which brought with it this easy transfer of money, of people, of goods, the use of the internet, the social media for recruitment, for command, for all kinds of things. I think similar to immigration and refugee issues, hardly not a new phenomenon, immigration, large numbers of refugees. But given the changes in these phenomenon, even if the changes are mainly quantitative, which they're not, there are all kinds of changes in these phenomenon, there's certainly a need to see if and how they affect conflict and conflict resolution. And here, too, I think we've got the role of globalization, because we have today transnational organizations, as well as, of course, communications, which makes a big difference. And all these things have changed and I think enabled and enhanced the role of diaspora, which is also a new topic, a new old topic. Indeed, in some countries, you even have ministries dealing with diaspora, or offices dealing with diaspora, specifically dealing with compatriots living abroad. Very often these have been set up by governments, in some cases out of self-defense, in some cases out of need, or wish to use diaspora or exploit them. Whereas in the past, there really were only one or two diaspora that were even talked about. Certainly the Jewish diaspora, particularly in the United States. Some people also used to speak about the Kurds. But basically, this was an area that simply wasn't part of international relations or conflict resolution. I remember many years ago, a colleague of mine, Gabi Scheffer, wrote a paper, an article on the Jewish diaspora in international relations and in the conflict, and people sort of looked at it, what are you dealing with this basically parochial topic? And I saw him recently, and of course he was sort of gloating, because now there are an enormous amount of literature on the role of the diaspora. It certainly play an important role in conflict perpetuation, in sometimes in escalation, sometimes in resolution. And I think the diaspora have been an important factor in cases of, well, I would say Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, and other places. And take, for example, the BDS movement, which I know you've heard about in this campus. BDS is almost totally a diaspora movement. The PLO leadership doesn't even fully support it. It's basically much more involved in outreach to Israeli society and so forth, which is not exactly the same thing as BDS. But in fact, BDS is a civil society movement. It is a movement of civil society. And here, too, we have an important new phenomenon. Civil societies, and maybe Tamar Herman will be talking about this as an expert on the topic. We have civil societies not only in democratic countries where we sort of expect them, but clearly civil society today around the globe, civil societies have a voice well beyond anything in the past. And they have the power to topple governments and to change maps, literally change maps. And as we've seen, and we see today in the Middle East, from Tunisia in 2011 to Libya to Syria, to Yemen to ISIS, clearly we're seeing something that comes to a large degree from civil society, with results that are having an effect well beyond the region, certainly around the world. So, with the characteristics of intractable conflict that I mentioned earlier, which include failed attempts at resolution, and important is, the question is, how do we get to the table? How do we get the protagonist to table? As important as that is, of course, it is important to figure out how to get from violence to talking, which is a key factor. But and the answers will relate to many, many different factors of getting from violence to talking. Many of these may be case-dependent, and we'll probably see some of them. But nonetheless, all of this remains secondary, I think, to how we get successful negotiations. Not enough to get people to the table, as difficult as it is. And look at how many times we thought that Colombia had been resolved. We did get them to the table. The question was, how do we get to where we are today, where you have successful negotiations, even in the case of protagonists who actually want to reach agreement. I say that because Oliver Richmond has talked about devious actors, that is, protagonists who get to the table with no intention of reaching an agreement. Devious actors, we know some of them who come to the table to buy time or to reduce pressure or what have you. So getting to yes, successful negotiations, to finally end intractable conflict, this opens another avenue of investigation, I think. I might add that international relations literature today, as well as peace studies, has also been looking at good agreements. What makes a good agreement? And a good agreement is generally one that lasts, period, lasts. And Barbara Waters has found that only a small percentage actually last past 3 to 5 years. Small percentage of negotiated agreements actually last beyond 3 to 5 years. The best chance she found, and this is not new, the best chance she published quite some time ago was agreements that have third-party guarantees. Others have found that power sharing is a very important aspect for a lasting agreement. Third-party guarantees, power sharing, and attention to peace building. Much more attention today to peace building, to DDR, to reconciliation. And I think, in fact, the field has come a long way. But there are, of course, still many questions left, not only regarding a model that somehow works, that is how to end, not just transform conflict, how to move from violence to talking, but how to actually end the conflict with a real end, I mean a genuine end that deals with the root causes of a conflict and not just the perhaps ephemeral grievances. And so that's not an easy thing to find, how in fact we can end these conflicts and completely resolve them. And there are a lot of those who say that there are conflicts that can't be ended. Maybe they can't be solved, they can be managed, they can be transformed, but not necessarily solved. The Sri Lankan conflict ended because of a military victory of one side over the other, the government over the minority. A military victory, but it was hardly a resolved conflict. I'm not entirely sure the Northern Ireland conflict has been resolved. It's clearly been transformed through power sharing, but let's wait. And there are those, of course, who say that our conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, can't be solved. And I think there's those, particularly in the present government, who thought that all along, that this was a conflict that could not be solved. And our prime minister, our esteemed prime minister, has said that we simply have to understand that we have to live by the sword. That's our future. Or maybe win by the sword, because there are those who think maybe that can be done. But I even have a very respected colleague who is not right-wing by any stretch of the imagination, who recently wrote a book called No End of Conflict, Rethinking Israel and Palestine. I don't agree that this is an insolvable conflict, although it's intractable. But the thinking along those lines is certainly increasing. And there are definitely some who believe that intractable conflicts are truly intractable and that we can only manage them. Certainly that was a thought that came after the failure of Oslo and the Camp David talks. And so I think there are many ways we can look at this, and it may be incumbent upon us to change our definition of intractable conflict or come up with a new theoretical concept. And I assume that we were going to hear a good deal in terms of substance on this possibly a redefinition of intractable conflict. And that's part of what we'll be trying to do here. But I want to mention something that, in closing, that came up actually last night in our discussion at the dinner table. And that was a question of just what role intellectuals, people dealing with these things, have or should play with regard to conflict. Just what is the role of intellectuals? And generally of intellectuals, people in all fields, but certainly, at least in my opinion, people dealing with these topics, conflict resolution, peace, perhaps more than people dealing with in other fields, disciplines. I think we tend to go into these things because we want a role, or we feel that we should have a role. And in many ways, I think that the question is particularly pertinent for those of us dealing with conflict resolution and peace studies. What is our role besides what we do in the classroom and the books that we publish? This is not a topic that we put on the agenda for this conference, but I do think it might be interesting as we listen to people and look at different conflicts and different ideas, changes that have taken place. Maybe we ought to think a little bit also about just what our role is, not just as intellectuals, but as engaged intellectuals, and what we can do with this knowledge that we gain and try to generate in order to actually make a difference in terms of conflict resolution and peace. Thank you.
So we have a couple minutes for questions, and then we'll take a quick break and get our panel set up. Anyone want to react or respond to Lou or Galia's very interesting comments? Yeah, please.
So again, the concept of intractable conflict in and by itself, I think, as we presented well, is also a sort of frame. And I was wondering if your work research is trying to answer the question of what kind of actors refer to their own conflicts as indeed intractable. What makes certain actors think in deterministic and realistic way about their own interaction with other groups? Right? What would make an actor think that there is no solution? The example that you provided of Netanyahu is an excellent. Why would certain actors do that? The other question that I have is perhaps a bit more of a devil advocate question, which is there is a kind of a presumption when we speak of conflicts that they are bad. Now, why are conflicts so bad? Presumably because they can lead to violence. And presumably that is bad because our sacred value is life. Now, the trouble, however, in that regard is that perhaps there are ways to promote life that we would not like to see. If we examine the history of various civilizations, we can see that Islamic civilization, for example, was rather peaceful throughout the era. So many advocates of a worldwide caliphate would say, well, this is a perfect solution for peaceful human civilization, right? So perhaps our sacred value is not so much life, which seems to be the hidden agenda behind trying to solve intractable conflicts, something else. Now, what is that? And if someone would argue that conflicts are perhaps essential to foster human creativity, to foster art, to foster science, would we still say that we would like to do away with conflicts? Just to put it on the table.
I'd like to say that part of the idea of
conflict resolution was that was a bad word to begin with. People who used it in Michigan were unhappy. They really wanted to say peace, but that was in the 1950s, and in America, peace was not a word that you threw around without being charged of being a commie. So they only put it in the title of the journal. But the value of the word transformation, which has become much more prevalent, is that it doesn't assume that conflict is bad. You know, even the word transformation, of course, is ambiguous. Well, it's always being transformed. The conflicts are dynamic. They get better and they get worse. So, well, we're talking about the getting better. And we don't specify what we mean by better, except, I guess, you were saying that it lasts longer, that there is some cessation of violence. But if you think that conflict can be done well, and many conflicts are done well, or relatively well, it's good. It's necessary for bringing about important changes. And if it's done well, both sides may benefit. It's a creative process. You know, marital disputes sometimes build better relationships because things get put on the table and you clear it up and say, oh, and you can get on better. And there's no reason to think that that isn't true at a macro level as well. The southern parts of the United States have benefited on the whole from the end of the Jim Crow and segregation. Everybody has benefited by that. And the women's struggle, men and women have benefited. So it's not the struggle that's bad. And the term conflict management was, people feel uncomfortable because that sounds manipulative. But, well, if you think, that's one reason I like the word constructive struggle, waging conflicts constructively, to do it well and thoughtfully, with some consideration always of what the so-called enemy is thinking and feeling.
I guess it depends on what you mean by conflict, because if you're juxtaposing conflict on one end to complacency on the other end, yeah, you're right, of course. Certainly conflict is better than complacency, but that's, I think, far too broad, because it is really is a question of what are we talking about, what kind of conflict. There can be constructive conflict, of course. Criticism can often be a sign of conflict between people in a government, which obviously is not what we're talking about. It's not negative. And I think it's fairly clear what we're talking about. It does, to some degree, hinge on whether or not it's violent. That sort of, but again, you get this question, what is, quote, low-intensity conflict, which is a term that I really dislike intensely. But it's not even that. I mean, I think we're talking more conflict versus peace. But even that, if you want, as a philosopher, you can take that in almost anywhere you want. It's part of the problem I have with this term transformation. I never liked it. Lou had me writing about it very early, and I, oh, okay. Because I was thinking in terms of life and death struggles. I was thinking in terms of conflict of the kind that we often are dealing with, not conflict in the schoolyard or not conflict between neighbors, but conflict that leads to violence and killing. And transformation, well, yes, it definitely makes a difference if you can move it from violence to nonviolence, to talking. But that's the same problem I have with managing. And I guess the word justice somewhere has to come into all of this. And I think there are many definitions, and each person's definition or perception of justice is also a question. But there has to be something beyond just people are fighting each other. And to say, well, we can manage this, we can keep it from escalating, means to a large degree perpetuating injustice. And so I think we have to go beyond transformation.
A couple more comments and then we'll break and go to the
I actually think that transformation is a suitable concept for conflict which are intractable. Because in a sense, as I see it in our own conflict, the very concept of resolution of the conflict is counterproductive, like peace, in a sense. And I claim that peace is the enemy of peace. Because you said, we can never achieve really peace, so let's manage the conflict. And I coined the terms of managing an imperfect settlement, which is like managing a transformation. Because such deep conflict, indeed, they persevere, they persist, they are transformed. Because there are many minor conflicts within each side of the conflict which come to the fore later on. So I think the word transformation of conflict is very valid, in my view, even more in intractable conflicts.
First of all, Galia, if you really believe that, I don't think, if you do, but anybody who said it, that Bibi is intractable, I would like to introduce you to his wife, Sarah. But she'll transform him, it's okay, if she wants to. About being deterministic, anybody who thinks a conflict cannot be resolved ever is as deterministic as Galia and me, who believe that it can be and should be. We are deterministic too. It's all a matter of faith. And the question is, why does Galia and why do I believe that this can be changed, can be made much better, and why others say, no way, even people who are not far left, far right wing or anything at all, just observing and analyzing. I would suggest it's a matter of your childhood, really. I was born in a kibbutz. We had lots of dogs, communal dogs. We had lambs, we had calves. We were happy, happy kids. So we believe that happiness is possible. Very simple. And if you grew up in a much more competitive and less less harmony in society, then you would incline more towards, well, maybe it cannot be solved and shouldn't be solved because it cannot be. So just a suggestion. But on the whole, we are just as deterministic. Is suppressing or ending a conflict always good? I would say it's really, you have to judge it by the merits of the particular case. I'm an historian. I'm not a political scientist. So I'm looking at each case in its own merits, and that's it. World War II was a terrible conflict. The only way it could be ended in what I would say is the right way is to conquer Berlin and conquer Rome. That was it. We conquered Sinai. We could conquer Cairo if we wanted to. Of course, we didn't. We could conquer Damascus in 67 if we wanted to. I was there. We were pretty close. We didn't. And we conquered wonderful West Bank and all that, Jerusalem liberated and so on. Look how the conflict looks now. So sometimes decisive military victory is a solution. Sometimes, and look at Germany and Japan today, sometimes it's not. America conquered Iraq, so it's really, here I would recommend the historical approach. Each case on its own merits, that's all. I would say win-win. The win-win approach is very, very real, but only in the very long term. In the short term, any conflict resolution that is successful has to leave both sides. That's not my invention. I'm quoting somebody far greater than me. Both sides are left reasonably unhappy. That's all. And in time, all of a sudden you realize it takes 10 years, 20, 30 years, that actually it was a purely win-win case, but not at the time. Well, I can say more, but this is...
So a couple of quick responses around research. I think there's a lot of different kinds of research that speaks to your issue of why people would see something as intractable. What I was mentioning to Danny, that research by Aaron Halper and Carol Dweck, I think is particularly relevant to that issue. In Colombia, I was struck by the fact that what they spoke about is, what some of my colleagues were speaking about is really just hate. Hate for the other side, a profound and deep hate. And I asked the question, do you think they can change? And they said no. And that belief, which Carol Dweck would call a kind of fixed entity belief, that people can't change, that groups don't change, and that conflict doesn't change, is a sort of fundamental implicit theory about the world. And people can hold different theories. They can hold the belief that things can change. That fundamental thing has been shown to have an impact on the intractability. You talked about the sacred value of peace, and I just wanted to, I think, build on previous comments, which is that depends on how we define it. There are 35 different types of peace. Some of them integrate human rights, justice, equality. Some of them are a fragile peace or a cold peace or an oppressive peace, right? So there are different kinds of nonviolence or peace. It depends on how we define it. I wanted to say one thing about transformation. So I believe in these settings, transformation is possible, but probably not transformation of the conflict, but transformation of the context. That when we focus on figure and not ground in these settings, we fall into a trap. And that it is really understanding the need to transform the context in which this is operating that will ultimately lead to either an irrelevance of the conflict or a passing of the conflict. So I really think it is what we sort of see. And so I think transformation has value. It may just not have value on the figure. And then one other thing I wanted to say, Lou was referring to the increasing complexity of the world and the context in which we're operating. And Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who's a former UN head of peacekeeping and is now the current head of the International Crisis Group, president of that, who really kind of watches these trends, talks today about a crisis of complexity in the world, that the world has moved from hegemony to bilateralism to multilateralism to what he calls this crisis of complexity, where you have so many non-state actors, hackers, social entrepreneurs, civil society. You have so many non-state actors, and yet the international community, certainly State Department, certainly the UN, doesn't think like that. We're still thinking at the state-to-state kind of diplomatic level, and this is a whole different game. And what I want to emphasize, though, is that game, that radical change, is a crisis because of our frames, our understanding, and our institutions, but it also presents extraordinary opportunity. One of the opportunities you mentioned is women, the role of women, recognizing that, supporting that, identifying that, studying that. So this crisis is what we find is it provides tremendous opportunities for change if we can see those.
Thank you. Wonderful opening discussion. Let's take a 5-minute break.